Greetings. In this session, we're going to be looking at some of our primary material from Unit 1, the Incarnation of Worship. You'll notice that you have a link to a blog that is tied to this very topic, the Incarnation of Worship. And if you go to that link, you'll find two chapters. You do need to read both chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And with this material, you'll find point by point with a logical connection of ideas, the meat of what you need from this material for later units and for testing purposes. But I also wanted to provide a video for you for a couple of reasons. First of all, we recognize that for some of you, reading is not necessarily your primary means of taking in information. So particularly in an online setting, that could be kind of challenging. So where we can, we want to provide videos so that you can process the information orally. Or for some of you, you'll watch and listen to the videos. Really, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter to me in regard to this video or other videos that we provided throughout the units, whether you watch and listen or just listen. You know, some of you might find it helpful to listen while you're doing exercise or while you're driving. So whatever works for you. So again, one of our reasons for doing this is we know we've got different learning styles, and there may even just be an issue of time in terms of this week. You may not have time to read the material, and it's just going to be easier for you to listen to it. I do want to encourage you, though, even if you're only able to watch this video regarding this primary material for Incarnation of Worship, I do want to encourage you to go back and read what's provided through the blog, because again, that's going to carefully go through the essential ideas, and they're strung together in a particular way, and it will allow perhaps for more reflection if you go back and go through the writing. But that doesn't necessarily have to happen for you this week. The other reason that I wanted to provide a video for you guys is it gives me an opportunity to expand on some of these ideas from Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 of Incarnation of Worship. This material is dense at times, in fact, particularly at the opening of Chapter 1. So it gives me an opportunity to expand a bit and make sure we're clear about what's going on here. Now, one other word before I begin, related to what's unfolding at the beginning of Chapter 1. In Chapter 1, for the first part, and to some degree throughout the chapter, I'm having a conversation with a person who doesn't necessarily know Christ. So you should see it in really more philosophic, apologetic terms. Let's just sort of suspend the idea that we understand that all of this is ultimately moving toward worship with the triune God of the Bible, relationship with Jesus Christ. Yes, we will get there quite quickly. But I want you to join me at the beginning of this discussion as though we were sitting down with the secular humanist, perhaps an academic person, perhaps a professor who's a secular humanist, perhaps someone that we might meet on the streets. I could imagine here in New Orleans we run into people who've sort of dabbled in various types of writings and sort of read just enough to make them dangerous. And so, we need to be comfortable listening to these ideas and then having a reasoned response for where their curiosities or inclinations are actually headed in terms of what we know to be God's design for them to come to relationship with Christ. Well, with that being said, we'll jump right into our Chapter 1 material. I would like for us to begin our journey in defining worship by allowing for a broad range of experiences in all modes of life. This suggestion might seem implausible, and yet in so doing, it seems that we should give some special label to an activity, action, word, or setting that we would elevate to the category of worship. Thus, two principles emerge for our initial discussion of worship. On the one hand, a willingness to recognize any human activity that glorifies Christ as worship, and on the other hand, a desire to place such activities into categories that match the transformed nature of such experiences. So we might use terms like spiritual. That would be a comfortable term for us as Christians. A philosopher might use the term aesthetic. I also wear an artist's hat. We might prefer to use artistic terms in some settings. For example, one might use an artistic term to describe the most menial of tasks as worship. And the specific example I give you here is Brother Lawrence from The Practice of the Presence of God. This is a wonderful book where this monk, Brother Lawrence, from several centuries ago, describes his worship experiences in connection to very basic human tasks. The one I highlight for you here is washing dishes. And Brother Lawrence comes to this place where he realizes that even the most basic of functions can become worship. It's really a wonderful concept. And by the way, I highly commend this book to you. It's a short read. It certainly would connect to spiritual formation. It certainly would connect to your personal worship. So we would commend this to you to grow in your understanding of worship. But really, I raise the issue of Brother Lawrence for a different reason, and that is to illustrate this point. Because what we tend to do, if we're reading this book about Brother Lawrence, or even reflecting on our own personal worship experiences that might be similar, you might have a similar moment in your life, or have come to a similar conclusion that basic tasks can become worship to the Lord. Well, we have a tendency to cast these moments in artistic terms. So we have a tendency, for example, to think of Brother Lawrence standing before this open window and the sun is shining on his face in a glorious manner, and he's holding up this dish to God that he's just cleaned, and perhaps there's a rag in his left hand that he's holding. Well, we even begin to add details that might not necessarily be in the book. And we can capture this moment in artistic terms. One could even say that Brother Lawrence's own reflections, being written in an autobiographical manner, could be described as a type of art, a type of sharing with other humans. So this is what I mean by our tendency to take the experience that was genuinely worship and to put it into a category that might be artistic. Well, indeed, there are experiences in life that move beyond mundane actions. These experiences are somehow more real, or a philosopher might want to use the term metaphysical. These experiences often have relational aspects, and we might recognize them cognitively or emotionally. I'm speaking of phenomena that philosophers call aesthetic moments. So I'm back to that term aesthetic. So Langer would be an example of a philosopher who would refer to aesthetics. If you want to read more about aesthetics, it really can be traced all the way back to the Greek philosophers. Aesthetics was the study of that which is beautiful. It is a subcategory of the more essential Greek philosophical question of what is real. So if you're seeking to answer what is real, a subcategory of that is what is beautiful. Now, I should note for you that very early in the semester, mind you, that you're going to see this same word, aesthetic, in the book Holy Gatherings. So Sharp and Smith use this term aesthetic. They are applying the term in a very specific way to talk about an aesthetic worship service. So it is connected to this root historic meaning, but they are applying the term to refer to more of a high church, traditional type worship setting. I just wanted to pause to point that out. This is basically a footnote because I don't want you to get the two terms confused, because I will, at some points in the semester or even in some materials, I might use the word aesthetic in a more broad philosophical sense, and that's how we're using it here. Now, yes, aesthetics are rooted in the Greeks, and the idea continues to be dealt with. It is, in a sense, the concept is examined in a deeper way in the 19th century by some important German philosophers, one of which is Hanslick. So those among us who may be Christian thought majors or apologetics majors, you might want to look at Hanslick and some of the German discussions happening in the 19th century because those haven't really gone away. This is still an important subcategory of both philosophy or theology or apologetics for that matter. So we're speaking of these phenomena that philosophers might call aesthetic moments, but social psychologists call flow. Now, this is a more recent category, whereas the philosophers were talking about going back to the Greeks. With social psychology, this is a much more recent phenomenon, particularly with this word called flow. So if you're curious about what the social psychologists have to say about these experiences and why they label them flow, I commend to you Csikszentmihalyi, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, and he really developed a quite rigorous system under this idea of flow. His discoveries were really not totally new. People had noted similar things, but you can become quite famous in academia if you can come up with a consistent label. And then he went further than that and tested this idea of flow. So there's been actually a somewhat recent, at least at the timing of this video, example of what we mean by flow that some of you might have seen. So I thought I'd use this as an illustration. This movie Soul. So some of you might have seen the Disney movie Soul. And in the movie, there is a scene where a basketball player is about to dunk a basketball, and he loses the flow, if you will, and can't dunk. And then, either right before that scene or right after that scene, there's an actor who forgets her lines. So what's happening with these two characters? They're in sports we might use the word zone. The basketball player's in the zone. In artistic terms, Csikszentmihalyi came up with this idea of flow. So an illustration of this, another illustration of this would be for some of you probably play guitar just for your own encouragement and your own mental and emotional health. So a person can sit down to play the guitar or the piano and totally lose all sense of time. Like you look down and 30 minutes have passed, an hour has passed, and it seems like it's been like 10 seconds. We don't stop to think about that, but that is really weird. That's a really weird occurrence that you would sort of lose track of time. Well, this is what Csikszentmihalyi means by flow. And again, you could imagine that this could be a worship experience for you, and you've got the social psychologist saying, oh, that's flow. You've got the philosopher saying, oh, that's an aesthetic moment. And we, of course, as Christians would say, no, actually, I'm offering this activity to the Lord as worship. So we recognize these experiences as being possible on a basketball court, at the beach, in the mountains, in the lawn, outside the chapel, at the family dinner table, or in a sanctuary. And we recognize these experiences. Even some agnostics recognize these experiences as the feeding of the soul at the highest level. Now, I have to tell you, when I refer to the agnostics here, the person I went to study with, really the person who became one of my two mentors at Florida State, he was an agnostic. And yet he had this amazing scene that he described in one of his books. And I can't remember if he told us this was his daughter or we just suspected, or folks suspected through the years of his daughter. So he describes this little girl. We'll just say she's 5 or 6 years old, and she's listening to classical music, and tears are running down her eyes. And the little girl is asked, "Well, why are you crying? Is something wrong?" And she shakes her head and just says, "No, nothing's wrong. It's beautiful, and it makes me cry." So here we have an agnostic trying to explain something that we would say as Christians is clearly the touch of the divine. I mean, why does a 5-year-old cry like that with classical music? Of course that's the touch of the divine. So that's what I mean when I say even an agnostic, because this was an agnostic writing these words in this case, recognizes this feeding of the soul. They'll even use words like soul. They recognize the feeding of the soul at the highest level. And I absolutely love C.S. Lewis' description of such experiences. In Surprised by Joy, which is very much autobiographical for Lewis, he explains that he tasted the aesthetic allure. So now I'm using the word aesthetics, right? So he tasted the aesthetic allure during imagination games in childhood. He particularly describes this in little games he would play with his brother, these imaginative games. And he remembered the same aesthetic feeling when he got older, even into adulthood, in listening to Wagner. Now, you may not be a fan of Wagner. Don't miss the point. The point is that there was this deep engagement with art. I mean, there's perhaps even some of you that somehow God used maybe a listening experience to rock and roll that somehow spoke of something beyond this world that puts you on a track that ultimately Christ led you to himself. Or some of you, there may have been an experience with a movie or some piece of art that drew you. Well, for Lewis, he realized that this drawing from the other, this vague otherness, what he describes elsewhere as the eternal, what he eventually concluded is that it is the compelling love of Christ. Now, you get that description of how he came to the conclusion of Christ in Mere Christianity. In fact, if someone were a lost person, if they were truly willing to read anything you suggested to them, a lot of times I'll just go straight to Mere Christianity because I've seen the Lord use that very impactfully in folks' lives. But if they were willing to read whatever, I might have them read Surprised by Joy first to sort of set up like part 2, which is where, both are going to describe coming to know Christ. But in Mere Christianity is going to give you that sort of step-by-step why Christ and not these other options. So they work really well as companion texts. Now, what has been described thus far is the hint of heaven, if you will, drawing us. A vague otherness that eventually comes into focus in the person of Christ. Most believers don't initially come into contact with the fullness of Christ's glory in an overwhelming physical sense as Paul did. Maybe you did, but I'm just going to venture to say that in any given class of worship leadership, most of us didn't have this overwhelming physical sense of connection as Paul did. Yet, all Christians have experienced the warmth of his presence or his drawing to some perceived emotional or even physical degree. We might even describe heavy emotions as physical. Moving beyond foundational cognitive awareness of the truth of Christ. And there's some tension there, and it's purposeful. So I'm just going to kind of let you live with that a little bit. And this invitation by the Father for relationships with humans is the otherworldly experience we are most longing for in the midst of activities that at times seem to take on greater meaning. So this is this key, this linchpin idea, this transitional statement that if we are talking to a lost person, we're wanting them to see that what's really going on with these experiences that they can share with us is the drawing of the Father into something beyond this world. Now, please don't think for 1 minute that I'm simply offering the perspective of an ethereal musician who just wants to talk about the fuzziness of God. I dare say that I'm as susceptible as any average religious academician to the allure of the sea of information about God that we call theology. I love swimming in this sea, and it is utterly unsearchable and quite pleasing in its own right. In fact, some would even claim aesthetic moments while partaking of some of such information. So, I would say that. I think I've had moments, reading theology or reading apologetics or maybe even reading a commentary that we could describe as worship, and thus we could use this other label, an aesthetic moment. But may we never forget that the real it of spiritual moments, including the moments when you're reading theology, that the real it of spiritual moments, whether they be called aesthetic moments by the philosopher, flow by the social psychologist, or worship by the theologian, the real it is the reality of our relationship with Him, right? And to deny the affective qualities of life, particularly what we experience through relationships, is to deny our humanness, specifically the manner in which God created us. I hope you're beginning to see the point of these inquiries into the nature of worship. Even though worship can be experienced through any activity, it's not really about the activity anyway. But before we move further, I want to emphasize again, now with the context of Christianity, that it is possible to have some of the most profound worship experiences in one's life driving in a car with one's spouse across the country as some powerful worship music is playing, or while jogging around a beautiful seminary campus as God suddenly answers a question you have been struggling with for days, weeks, or years. That's happened to me in a sense. We know that Mozart and Beethoven would sometimes, when they were stuck with their compositions, or perhaps even as a matter of routine in the compositional process, would go for a walk, and an idea would just sort of fall upon them that they needed to keep the composition going. Well, I certainly think this happens for us as Christians. Is there something we're dealing with? And it's absolutely sometimes as we just get out and get moving, perhaps even through exercise, that an idea will just, it seems to just land on our brains out of nowhere. I would suggest to you, and to me this is sort of part of Brother James's point in the book of James, that at that moment, when that solution comes, immediately give credit to God for that. James says every good and perfect gift is from above. It comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variableness. So just assume that if it's good and productive and healthy, that it's from God, and give God glory for that. And then all of a sudden that moment becomes worship. With Beethoven in particular, we would say that it probably wasn't, because he didn't know the Lord Jesus Christ. And yet in some ways the process is similar. So, when we dig into this, part of this does have to do, I talked about the labels at the beginning. Are you willing to label it as being from God? Are you willing to give thanks to God for this moment? And then all of a sudden, all of these wonderful moments in your life, as James said, every good and perfect gift is from above. So encourage you to think in those directions as you can consider worship. The other reference I gave there has a particularly poignant emotional connection for me that sort of, in some ways, sums up some of what has been said. I remember a particularly powerful drive with my wife, just really hours after we had found out that her dad had a very, very, very short time to live. We had moved from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, from Goshen, Mississippi, to Tallahassee. And my wife's father had gloriously come to know Christ, had been baptized at the very end of his life. So we had peace about that, but we knew that his death was imminent. And in fact, and folks, listen, there's just these moments, these seasons. Some of you have already experienced what I'm about to say. Some of you will. So I hope you can remember this, and this will be some encouragement or consolation to you. But you'll just go through seasons where it's just, one thing after another. So my grandmother had actually passed away within days of this call about my wife's dad. And my parents were coming by. They were going to actually, we were either going to ride with them or we were going to follow them down to a service for my grandmother. And we actually ended up having to go a different direction because of my wife's father's situation. So there was a lot to process. And on the drive, we got the news that my wife's dad had passed away. And I don't remember exactly what happened. I remember worship music. I remember it being a deep moment of worship with my wife. Also, of course, just being broken for her. I mean, all of that, of course, gets mixed together emotionally. But I certainly would describe her reaction before the Lord, our communion together before the Lord. I certainly would describe that as worship. Now, an interesting thing about this is I was describing this in one instance, and I think I had done this before, and I had somehow included a song that there's no way I knew this song at the time because it had not been written. So later, I had a student in Georgia, some of you might have heard of, Matt Papa, and one of his early songs, in some ways still my favorite song. Maybe it's because it was written before he became quite known in evangelical circles. But if you don't know this song by Matt Papa, I'd even encourage you to pause right now and go listen to it. 23 by Matt Papa, incredible. It's a setting of Psalm 23. And I had somehow interjected that listening experience, and I think we did listen to 23 at a later point with the death of another family member, but I had somehow, and my wife had to remind me, we didn't even know Matt Papa, he had not even written the song. So this sort of illustrates the point I made about Brother Lawrence earlier, is that when we reflect on our worship experiences, we do tend to put them in these artistic terms and even add details. And of course, there was nothing malicious there on my part or purposely fabricated. It's just the way our brains tend to put things together. So again, it's just interesting the way we relate to these worship experiences, and we'll continue to delve into this as we go. Now, related to these two scenarios I've given you here and illustrated with these two stories, the jogging around the campus and the Lord gives us this idea, or the drive with your wife, and it's this powerful worship experience. Either of these scenarios is quite plausible. And yet it's not about trying to recreate these or other events you might have experienced. It's about experiencing the Creator in fresh personal ways and giving God the glory for initiating and sustaining a relationship with us. So again, notice the further we go into this, I'm trying to move us beyond the experience, and I've sought, even though I did it very briefly, to move us beyond just the cognitive recognition, which some of you may be more susceptible to relationship. Because really, regardless of our personality, regardless of whether we sort of are more inclined toward that emotional description or the more cognitive recognition of theological concepts and settling into those, really both personalities, both camps, if you will, need to move toward the idea of relationship. So although worship in its purest form goes beyond artistic description and can enter most any phase of human activity, let's practically recognize, now this is a turning point. You might want to take a note here, because I've been talking about personal worship experiences up to this point, and we're about to shift gears. So even though it can enter most any phase of human activity and receive this artistic description, let's practically recognize that corporate worship is commonly and most happily experienced through artistic mediums. Now, when I present this lecture in class, I sort of pause here to see if I can get a reaction. I'm almost hoping to sort of get a reaction, particularly from my guys in the class who feel called to proclaim the Word of God. Because here I've said that our corporate worship experience, our corporate worship is most commonly and happily experienced through artistic mediums. So I in a sense, sort of tried to start a fight there to some extent. But let's think about this for a second. Even preaching, in the manner in which we teach it here at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, I mean, we would say there's an art of preaching, right? There's a craft of preaching. In fact, the further you go into your studies, particularly, for instance, for these guys who would do a PhD in preaching, they are going to become familiar with Aristotelian rhetoric, concepts, principles, and admonitions. So, you know, if that's not an art of preaching, then I'm not sure what is. So stay with me here, because I am allowing for a very broad conception of artistic mediums. But if some of you would like to say, well, maybe the reason you want to use that phrase artistic mediums is because you're an artist, I would not argue with you too hard. So, that's fair. That's fair. But just hang with me here. Let's see where this is going. So I'll not judge which mode of artistic presentation is most important at this point. However, when studying the history of cultural religious activity, one sees certain patterns emerge. So here would be a category, for example, that we might look to. And Baptists, to be honest, or even evangelicals, we're not real big on this, but architecture. I mean, we've pretty much come to the conclusion as Baptists, I would say, generally speaking, and I would tend to say this happened in the 20th century, is that the cheapest way we can get up shelter, and in the South it would need to have air conditioning, and it would need to have good technology once we got into worship bands. And at first, though, the technology of the microphone would have just been about the clarity of proclamation, and that still, I would say, would be our chief aim with our technology, is clarity of proclamation. But really, in terms of architecture, we're just like slap up some building where people are safe, that's not going to get knocked down by a hurricane if you're down here in New Orleans, and make sure that we've got air, and make sure we can hear the preacher clearly. And now that we've got worship bands, we probably want pretty good technology for that. So we're not really into the aesthetics. Okay, here's that word again, the beauty of the building. I think we may see things trend back to that, because later in the course we'll talk about kind of some counter trends that are happening as we are in the roaring 21st century 20s. It's interesting how history echoes. I think we could use that term of the 20s and the 21st century in somewhat similar ways as we did 100 years ago, particularly coming off of a pandemic. Quite interesting parallels. But that may happen in certain instances with Baptists, but overall we'd say Baptists are not as into this aspect of worship art, but it is important, right? And again, as I said to you at the beginning, I'm still kind of moving beyond the bounds of just Christianity and talking about spirituality in general. So, for example, Indian temples would be an example. These very carefully thought through structures. What about the Dome of the Rock? I mean, it is a beautiful structure. We would have to admit that. How about the Parthenon? Well, and within Christianity, how about Gothic cathedrals? The Gothic cathedral, and we'll talk about this later with history, is a tour de force of artistic expression and scientific discovery. It's just amazing what's going on with the Gothic cathedral. Well, how about music? Again, beyond the bounds of Christianity. How about Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and his Pakistani Sufi songs? Look these up on YouTube. For me as a musician, Really fascinating stuff. Really fascinating stuff. Ravi Shankar, with his sitar ability that has tones, pitches that are between our Western temporal toning system. Fascinating stuff. And the tabla, the rhythmic system with the tabla, which actually will divide a beat into very complex sets of numbers. For example, 17 or even over 100. And just sounds really interesting. The Beatles got a little curious about Ravi Shankar and in his music that's connected to Hinduism. And of course, in Christianity, the Haydn Lord Nelson Mass, one of my favorite pieces of all time, Gregorian chant, which gives a mood in Christian meditation that we really don't have anything in the modern world to compare to it. But, and what about visual art? So we have Michelangelo's Pieta, which the Pieta is in a sense based on the theme of Madonna and Child, another idea that we'll explore later in the history lectures. Madonna and Child is a very important painting in both Greek Orthodox and Catholic Church. Most often we think of it as Mary holding the baby Jesus. The Pieta is Christ holding Jesus after the cross, in anticipation of his resurrection, but it captures the passion in a very poignant way even the incarnation as Mary is there holding Jesus. It's a powerful, powerful sculpture by Michelangelo. And Hindu idol sculptures, which are very fascinating and perhaps we would even say dangerously alluring. So, of course, the spiritual experience is cast in these artistic mediums. But now, I've saved one of these for last for a purposeful reason. What about drama? Okay, so we have the Rigveda in Hindu worship, this storyline that's very important. But what about the Bible? Is Passover not a drama that is intended to play out, yes, for the nation of Israel, but in individual families? I mean, when we begin to get into worship in future units, of course we're going to talk about family worship. What an amazing concept that you would remember a story, okay? And we've already talked about in the lecture how we have this human tendency to add details to story. Well, here was a way for the Israelites to remember the story accurately and to even have the children participate. And they're literally acting it out, because when you're taking the meal, you're acting out, yes, in a more relaxed fashion, but you're acting out and telling the story of how God rescued Israel from the Egyptians. And this is the narrative that defines the people of Israel, their rescue. Yes, we could go back to Genesis, of course. Jehovah, God, Hashem, Yahweh rescues, creates the world, picks Abraham. But all of this leads up, right, to his chosen people Israel, and he rescues them. This is like the heart of the narrative, God saving his people. And I can tell you, we've done Passover in our home for several years now, and my kids have come to love this experience. Even adult children have now, based on where they might be at any point in time, if they're close to New Orleans, we get together for Passover meal. And it's a powerful, very, very powerful worship experience for us. And I would suggest to you, perhaps some of this might perk up the ears of some Christian educators among us, that God knows what he's doing by giving us a drama to act out. I think I heard this originally years ago from a guest speaker. But, there's this idea that, of course, I'm jesting in saying this, that God is really smart Like he knows what he's doing. We get to the 20th century as humans and discover all these educational theories and realize, kids probably would learn it better if they're doing it, if they're participating. Well, God knows this, of course. So be open to this possibility of artistic mediums, particularly from the standpoint of God himself gives us an artistic medium in the drama for the family to play out as perhaps, we could even say perhaps the most powerful, perhaps the most important of, yes, Yom Kippur is also very, very important, but this central, perhaps most central Jewish festival of Passover. And of course, the purely scientific anthropologist, if we kind of change gears here, the purely scientific anthropologist sees Christian religious art as merely a subcategory of general religious art. So again, I'm keeping this conversation going with the secular humanists, because what are they going to say? They're going to say, and let's say their field is anthropology. They're going to say, yeah, this is all fine and good, and they're going to explain to us, how humans have evolved and how in their evolution they needed this idea of religion, and then art came out of this, and this is religious art that's coming out of this evolutionary development. That's probably going to be their answer. And although it is curious that in the entire history of art in the world, we would say a good portion of it is religious art, and then the other really big portion is art that relates to love and attraction between a man and a woman. And of course, as Christians, we would say, well, in terms of God's perspective, if we follow Torah, if we follow God's best for us, then all of that fits together, right? So furthermore, the agnostic or the atheist anthropologist would argue that all religious art has emerged through evolution. But it might be instructive for both anthropologists and Christ followers to consider the following fundamental questions. So here's a question to consider. What aspect of humanness makes us want to express art for the purpose of worshiping a spiritual being? We seem to be genetically predisposed to do this. It's just phenomenal when you read the literature, like social psychological inquiries into music. There is this idea out there that we have this genetic predisposition to like certain kinds of melodies, and even to create. It's a wonderful thing that even secular scientists have to recognize. Now, Pascal, who lived between 1623 and 1662, so this is 17th century, Pascal, of course, argued that we were created with a void or need in our life, and the fact that this need exists proves God's existence. So here's the quote. There's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator made known through Jesus. And of course, this is, a very popular, if you will, argument, apologetic argument for Christianity, that we've got this vacuum that only God can fill. Now, to the extent that one accepts Pascal's argument that humanity's common need for God suggests God's existence, one could also argue that the common human desire to create religious art reveals that God endowed us with the gift of creativity for the purpose of honoring Him. Or if you will, let me suggest the Christian artist's creed derived from the Westminster Confession. God specifically gave us artistic abilities and sensibilities to glorify Christ. And in acting upon these creative impulses in a biblically sound manner, we enjoy Him and celebrate God-honoring relationships with others. So we can't just ignore these artistic expressions of worship. To do so would be to ignore our humanness. And I just want to pause there to say, again, to our future or current preachers in the room, And some of you are very artistically sensitive. Some of you are very, very cognitive, and we love this about you because you're able to lay out propositional truth in an amazing way that's an encouragement to me, to my family. We need you desperately, and God has ordained that you lead our churches. So praise be to God for that. But I just want to say to you to take some time, particularly if you don't have that artistic sensibility, to go back and go back to the material that's written out and think about what was just said there in terms of it does seem that God created us with this predisposition to create and to do that to honor God. So you want to celebrate artists. You want to help shape them, and you want a church that's going to shape these artists and to come alongside families, perhaps even dads that don't know what to do with the little artist, and help them learn how to shape the artists for the glory of God. Now, another question we might consider as we seek to understand our God-given desire to worship is related to the validity of our worship expressions. Are some worship experiences more valid than others? In seeking to answer this question, often sincerity is emphasized. And certainly the Bible mandates sincerity as a necessary component in proper worship. We think of this verse from Deuteronomy 4:29. If with all your hearts you seek me, that does sound like sincerity, right? If with all your hearts you seek me, you shall surely find me. But even in this statement, a good deal is assumed beyond sincerity, right? Seeking me establishes the God of the Bible is the object of worship. So we need to point that out if we use this verse in seeking to win someone to Christ. This is not just about sincerity. This is written from the perspective of Yahweh, the God of Israel. It's about seeking Him. It establishes the God of the Bible as the object of worship. And the manner in which one was to seek God with all their heart was carefully explained in the Old Testament. For example, and this was an issue in the ancient Near East, right? For example, killing your children as an expression of seeking God was strictly forbidden. So you couldn't just be sincere and do this thing that you think that you're supposed to do out of sincerity. And folks, this concerns me today because I believe we were living in an era right now that is a key era in perhaps human history, certainly in Western culture and American culture, but I really think it's global. We're living in a moment that reminds me of the Enlightenment. You know, I go back and look at the Enlightenment and even founders that I really respect lose their belief in the Trinity toward the end of their life because of enlightenment. Wow, what a bad conclusion to come to. And we're living in one of these eras right now where we are seeing folks who profess Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior reject orthodox ideas and principles. And we've got to be on guard of that for ourselves, for our families, certainly for the people that the Lord has given us to shepherd. And we've just got to be careful about this. And I would even suggest to you, and I think this is beginning to happen, that we're seeing things even brought into the worship. Because what happens is it begins to change around the dinner tables and conversations on Twitter. Orthodox beliefs begin to be attacked. People begin to adopt non-Orthodox beliefs. But where's it going to make its way? We've already said this, is we turned the curve a minute ago into corporate worship. Because we're now dealing with corporate worship. We're not just dealing with that individual worship experience. Where does it tend to go? It's going to tend to go to the liturgy. So we're going to tend to embed these new systems of belief, which are not really new because questioning Orthodox teaching is not a new thing. But our particular version of that in the 21st century as Americans, whatever the case may be, wokeism, it gets embedded in our liturgies. And so you are absolutely called as ministers of the gospel to protect your worship services from such things and to carefully think through them. Thus, the typical recognition of sincerity is a partial answer to the question of validity must be expanded to the following questions. Number one, what is the object of our worship? We must deal with that first. What is the object of our worship? You have or will deal with this question thoroughly in systematic theology. Thoroughly, right? To say it concisely, we engage in worship with the triune God of the Bible who has revealed himself to us most clearly in the person of Christ. So, of course, we'll deal with this material, and no doubt you'll get some things from our preaching professor that will relate to the theology, but really we have a separate class for that at seminary, right? Systematic theology. You will explore this thoroughly. And number two, are there some cultural religious experiences that are more valid than others? Here's where the debate, hopefully we don't really have a debate about number one. I mean, I'm talking about the major points of Christianity under number one, like the Trinity, the personhood of Christ, fully God, fully man, the path to salvation through the death, burial, resurrection of Christ and a personal relationship with him, confessing our sins, asking him to be Lord of our lives, the essentials of the gospel. Certainly I hope that we're all in agreement on number one. Number two, we're going to have some disagreement. Because the question is, are there some cultural religious practices that are more valid than others? Well, of course there are, but the purely scientific anthropologist worldview might prevent her from asking this question. So notice we're starting to get some more separation. We've had this conversation this whole time, really. We've had, perhaps sitting over here to my left, the secular humanist. In fact, I've had 3 or 4 because I've put on different hats: the social psychologist, the philosopher, the anthropologist in this case. The anthropologist, there is some good reason why I'm saying this. Like in the world of music, anthropology mixes with musicology and something called ethnomusicology. The ethnomusicologist kind of has a hard time discriminating whether this art is better than this art. Now, a classically trained musician has no problem telling you that Bach is better than Twisted Sister, okay? But a ethnomusicologist will sometimes have a hard time, and this is part of the nature of their field, and we love this about them. They're going to go camp out, as one of my professors did, in Bali for over 10 years. And so they're going to have this very nuanced and celebrated view of Balinese gamelan. So the anthropologist is going to have a hard time saying this experience is more valid than this one. Now, the answer to this question of which cultural religious practices may be more valid, the answer to this question regarding validity, which is addressed to some degree below in what follows, reveals one of the basic points of differentiation between Christian worship and all other religious practices. And this is a fundamental question with which you will need to wrestle in terms of filtering culture and worship. In every instance of religious practice, no matter how powerful or aesthetically wooing, okay, there's our word aesthetic again, no matter how powerful aesthetically wooing, humans are exhibiting their best to engender some particular response from God or the gods. There is a somewhat recently written book about ancient singers and just some phenomenal archaeological research that is revealing to us that among the Assyrians, among the Babylonians, among the Persians, there was a particular now very, very few were educated to the point that they read the books that were written at that time. But there was a system that allowed a very select few to be trained, and then they would go into subcategories. Well, they started really with a very general education, and then you would get into this subcategory of training. And the most important one, as far as the king was concerned, were if you will, the scholarly singers. Because these scholarly singers were trained in how to keep the angry gods from destroying the nation. So you could imagine, however much attention and money and comfort these singers needed to be on. Because if they got their songs to the angry God's wrong, then they were going to be destroyed. Of course, we laugh at this, but it illustrates the point that in the whole history of the world, in terms of religious practice, humans are exhibiting their best to engender some particular response from God or the gods. By contrast, don't miss this, only in the Old Testament and New Testament worship do we see God revealing himself to mankind and explaining what he desires from worshipers. He's telling us what he wants. If one compares, speaking of this, if one compares instructions for worship in the Old Testament with instructions for worship in the New Testament, one finds multiple sets of instruction for worship in the Old Testament. Perhaps you haven't thought about that, but in the Old Testament, we've got lots of instructions for worship as compared to very few sets of instruction for worship in the New Testament, which is perhaps one reason we debate this, but again, I would suggest to you that God's not surprised by any of that, and sometimes our debates lead to very, very good things. If we act peaceably to one another and give these arguments to the Lord and say, Lord, help us. So can we assume something from the difference in the amount of specificity, like the large amount of specificity in the Old Testament versus very little specificity in the New Testament? Is God? So here's a question. Was God surprised when his call to worship in spirit and in truth? So those are some parameters. Okay, that would be one of these few instances where you have very specific parameters. His call to worship in spirit and truth began to take on many different cultural forms. Do you think God was surprised by that? When his parameters, those who worship me will worship me in spirit and truth, must worship me in spirit and truth, that it took on these cultural forms. Greek Orthodox iconic art. Palestrina's motets. Mexican posada songs. There is Christian Indian music with tabla and sitar. So is God surprised by this? No, I don't think so. Thus, an intended consequence may arise as each culturally embedded Christian generation discovers the germinative nature of Christ's instructive words. Freedom, and I am connecting this to those who worship me, must worship me in spirit and truth. By the way, there's a little bit of an expanded explanation in your midterm review materials, which you shall see shortly in an upcoming unit, if you're curious about going there. We do go there. But for now, let's just suffice it to say from this statement, those who worship me in spirit and truth, freedom engendered by a command within broad parameters. Now, when I say broad, I only mean broad in comparison to all of this specificity. There's another sense in which it's very narrow because we must go through Christ. Now, can we argue that any one Christian culture among the vast subcategories of Christian cultures is superior to others in their understanding of Christian worship? So if I didn't have some folks riled up in the last bit, I am sure I'm getting some riled up now. Can we argue that there's some Christian cultures that are superior to others in their understanding of Christian worship? If there's an argument that any one cultural form of worship has superior status, it would certainly be the Jewish culture within the context of first century Christianity, right? I mean, in the same way that when we're trying to figure out how to do church, when we're trying to figure out, how to explain the gospel, well, we go back to the New Testament. And we look to Acts for first century practice by New Testament Christians. So the same would be true of worship. So if there's any argument for a superior cultural perspective, it would be Jewish culture within the context of first century Christianity. And in saying this, I'm not suggesting that we should be legalistically returning to Jewish worship practices. Paul certainly did not suggest such a return. My ulterior motive in recognizing Jewish culture as the only potentially more authoritative worship culture is to warn against the labeling of Western worship art as superior in a spiritual sense. Now, as much as I love the great Western history, we're talking about Western Europe when I say Western here. I love the great Western history, and in my view, the aesthetic superiority of the worship art created by the West. Now notice that I actually believe that there is an aesthetic superiority by the art created in the West. If you want to sit down over coffee sometime, I would be glad to tell you why I think Bach Cantata 106, Movement 5 might be the actual high point of all Christian art ever created. I do actually believe that, and you have the great privilege of teaching a lot of worship art here that involves some of that. So even though I have these views, we must not suggest that Western hymns or other Western worship practices are inherently more spiritual than other cultural manifestations of worship just because they are Western. In other words, I'm giving you my opinion. I can't say that God is more pleased with Bach than your favorite worship song that just got written last week. That's a vast chasm that I won't even venture into. No, God's perspective has to do with this statement of those who worship me must worship me in spirit and truth. So unfortunately, although evangelicals have made great strides in their scholarly and philosophical explorations of worship over the past 75 years, for example, many recognize Tozer as the beginning of this new wave of thought, we find this subtle theme of Western superiority in some of the great books on worship produced since Tozer. And I would even suggest to you, since I wrote these words about a decade ago, I actually think this is increasing in our churches. And I'll talk again, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, I'll talk more about some counter movements right now, and I don't think they're all bad. I'm just giving a warning here that we've got to be very careful about saying that or thinking that God likes our Western worship better than He does some other sincere and God-honoring cultural worship that might exist anywhere on the globe or within the United States. So to summarize, I have emphasized 2 points thus far. Worship, in its purest sense, goes beyond human activity descriptors. So it goes beyond human activity descriptors. And the seemingly contradictory point is that worship tends to be most consistently and most impressively experienced through artistic mediums. And that second point, note that it's particularly connected to corporate worship, because we had that point about halfway through this lecture where I really switched gears from personal worship, which is more principle 1, worship in spirit sense goes beyond human activity descriptors. And then as I moved into this idea of artistic mediums being the expression, we were talking about corporate worship. That's important for you to know, because this class is called not worship, right? It's called worship leadership. So it's important that we recognize, even in Unit 1, of course we were going to start with how all of human life should be worshiped. We have to have that principle in place, and I'm sure when you're in spiritual formation, you'll talk about that. In some ways, the class spiritual formation deals with personal worship, or we might say that class is more designed for discipleship and personal worship, whereas this class, yes, that's our starting point, but we very quickly move into corporate worship. You are the worship leader, thus the name of the class. So together, these 2 points, worship in its pure sense goes beyond human activity scriptures, and seemingly contradictory point that worship tends to be most consistently and most impressively experienced through artistic mediums, talking about mainly corporate worship there, and together these 2 principles form a philosophical foundation for the primary theme that will emerge in the next chapter, the incarnation of worship.